living the good life is really being, having that discipline of being able to have the teachings sit inside and be able to manifest those teachings in a way that um, allows them to grow. In other words, it's not like a dead thing, it's like an interactive thing. So allows me to see those teachings in real life. And those teachings are basically friendship, love, compassion, um, nonviolence, truthfulness, things like that.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reflections on Living Well podcast, where we explore perspectives on the good life in the 21st century. I am your host, Broderick. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Reflections on Living Well podcast. Today, our guest is Premdas Rohan. Premdas is a retired teacher and teaches as a substitute teacher in the public schools. He has taught all ages of students from 2 years to the elderly. He combined his love of science and mathematics in the classroom with his love of yoga practice, teaching students mindfulness, breath awareness, precepts for living a virtuous life based on nonviolence, and postures. Premdas studied Ashtanga Yoga with Baba Haridas from 1974 until his passing in 2018, starting in Miami, Florida. He is a senior teacher at Mount Madonna Center, having taught there continuously from 1980 to the present. He is one of several pujaris at the Hanuman Temple at Mount Madonna Center and has been instrumental in opening up ritual leads to women. He offers morning arati at least 2 times a week and has done so since the temple was founded in 2003. He periodically conducts fire rituals, or yajna, and began offering vegan-only versions of fire rituals in 2017. Premdas teaches philosophy classes through Mount Madonna Center and Watsonville Yoga, both in person and online. He currently co-hosts Mount Madonna Center Bhagavad Gita class, which he has done for over 30 years, and a hybrid satsang yoga philosophy once a month at Watsonville Yoga. Premdas, how you doing, my brother?
Hey, Broderick. I'm doing very good. Thank you. Nice to see you.
You too. I'm excited for this conversation. I
Happy to be
love
here.
that. Yeah, what'd you say?
Happy to be here.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, that's a good thing. That's a good start.
Good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you have such a long background in the practice of yoga, teaching and philosophy, both from the perspective of the Bhagavad Gita and as well as the Yoga Sutra. And so I think that'll be very interesting. I think some interesting things will probably, I assume, will come up in this conversation if we're not, even if we're not directly talking about those particular texts.
Mhm.
And in your time with Babaji and all those years of studying and practicing yoga and teaching and doing fire ceremony, which is called a yajna, and the various rituals of pujas at the Hanuman Temple as a pujari, pujari, and I guess that translates to like a priest in English.
Mhm.
So you've done all of that. I assume that has informed your perspective on what a good life means. I know
Definitely.
I just Yeah, I know I just read that bio. So, but I still like guests to introduce themselves beyond the script.
Well, anyway, welcome. Thank you for having me, and happy to be here for your guests that are tuning in. Um, yeah, I think the bio, I spent some time on it. Basically, I can see myself as a yoga instructor, yoga student, really more, and from an early age, and coming out of a large family of 13, 12 siblings. Um, and yeah, and then my work in education, finding a beautiful system of education called the Montessori education as a young person, and experiencing young children in what I would call a super free and open environment for them to really blossom and learn without um, adult restrictions on conduct and so forth. Just to be able to see a society of 33 2.5 to 5.5 year olds working together daily for 180 days of the year, seamlessly. So that really informed my educational perspective, not just in the young kids, but also for all the way through high school and even beyond in college. Um, so yeah, so I kind of see those are my two kind of out experiences, experiencing out in the world. And then I have my own personal practice, which is informed by, my teaching, my study with Baba Haridas, and philosophy study. So yeah, so outward and inward, both of those are ongoing seams, you could say, or ongoing avenues or threads in my life. And yeah, living a good life is really being able to balance those, but also to allow both of those to be fully expressed. So making sure to take the time for myself, a lot of times in the past, and it has happened to me when I had a child and, family and so forth, where there's a limited amount of time that you are able to spend on your own practice or your own kind of self-development. But I always found time, whether it was, half an hour or 20 minutes, to do something every day. And my teacher, Baba Haridas, would say that, it's kind of like we don't forget to eat. So why will we forget to work on ourselves or to give us some time for um, our own self-development in the day? So Babaji would call it daily sadhana. So daily practice, and a lot of people see sadhana as being sitting on a cushion, but I see it more expressive and more fully expressed in thousands and maybe millions of different ways with each person, and how they do it. So sitting on the mat is certainly one way, but and it gets expressed, um, that inner work gets expressed in many other ways as well. So yeah, so
Awesome.
those are my two um, kind of, you could say, lifelines. And living a good life is, seeing, continuing, and to, in the Bhagavad Gita, it says Arjuna, asks, can I stop working? And Krishna says, no, you have to keep at it. You have to keep doing your dharma. You have to keep doing your work in the world. And sometimes it gets maybe frustrating, or it feels like maybe it's not working, and but you just keep doing it, So and I have found that is really um, the way to go. Just to keep at it, keep working. So
Awesome.
yeah.
Well, that's awesome. You jumped right on into the question of what does living well mean to you, and that's good. With that introduction, yeah, lifelong life of practice and study, and being an educator and being influenced by young children. That's awesome. Can you say a little more about what living well means to you? I know you stressed practice and as a major piece of the puzzle. But can you elaborate on the I don't like the word essence necessarily, but the I can't think anything else right now.
Yeah.
So, what's the essence of living well means to you, or the good life, or a life worthy of living?
Yeah, for me, it's more of a feeling expressed. I'm more of a feeling type of a person. Um, so living well means being able to engage socially in my family and in life with people in a way that um, doesn't take away from who I am. So I'm not trying to please people. I'm not trying to change people's minds. I'm really more um, trying to be an expression of the love that I feel and that I have been given in my life. Um, and the definition of love in my vocabulary is not some movie version of it. It's more of living selflessly. Like getting out
Mm.
of the way. I think that the Montessori education really, the key aspect of that, when I was studying and early on, and became um, it became my life work. Education with kids was just the idea of not just allowing them to express themselves freely and not getting in the way, to basically step away from my own ego. And really, the teachings in yoga and the teachings in education are the same. Like you living well means you get face to face with your ego, and you have a choice. You can defend, get angry, or step back, take a breath, and try to see what your involvement is, what your ego is saying. What's my attachment? What's my selfishness in this particular situation? What am I trying to get out of this? And then that's one step, and then trying to maybe reflect later, and say, oh yeah, I could have done this, or this could have happened. And how did I get into that situation where I became like really super involved, or just became super negative or emotionally angry at something? So living a good life is really having that discipline of being able to have the teachings sit inside and be able to manifest those teachings in a way that allows them to grow. In other words, it's not like a dead thing, it's like an interactive thing. So allows me to see those teachings in real life. And those teachings are basically friendship, love, compassion, um, nonviolence, truthfulness, things like that. um, and then I don't know. I mean, I think living a good life is also like helping. But the word helping kind of gets a little bit more distracted, or gets a little bit more layered when we think of I'm helping because it makes me feel good. So that's the ego part that wants to feel good about helping. So it's more just being able to just step back and do my work or do my dharma, which in this case I've chosen to be a teacher, to be involved with students. And so in that interaction, I just try to be open, listen. So living the good life is engaging, but with a little bit less ego identification and selfishness each time. Anyway.
I love it. Love it, love it, love it. Let's unpack some of that because there's so much there. I think
Okay.
there's so much wisdom in a lot of what you just said.
Sure.
Yeah, summing it up like that. I love that how you suggest that education and teaching is very similar to or the same as what we're trying to cultivate in yoga,
Mhm.
particularly what you're doing with young kids and really allowing them to be free and open. And so I have a question about that. So how do you find the balance? Because I know yoga is, because you mentioned it as well, is discipline is an important piece of the puzzle with yoga. How do you find that balance between discipline and freedom? That freedom that you're speaking of, with I know young children. I know, that's really important for young children to give them that freedom. But as adults, how do we find that delicate balance between discipline, structure, and freedom?
It turns out that kids love discipline,
Right.
and they want it. Discipline really allows the mind to think clearly and concentratedly. An undisciplined mind is one that's jumping from one thing to another. And I think our society really, in terms of education, and I've been in many classrooms where it's kind of like a TV commercial, do this, do this, do this. And not much time is really left for the individual to engage in meaningful work. By meaningful work, I mean something that speaks to them and allows them to, just to relax and feel safe, just that first feeling of safety, and then once the safety issues is addressed, then all of a sudden the creative element starts to unfold for students. But when we when we jump and when we teach in an undisciplined way, when we don't teach students how to discipline themselves, then they don't really get a chance to sit in that stage of creativity, and it gets frustrating. And so that's when you have the discipline problems. It's more really, from my perspective, it's more the structure is not correct as opposed to
Mm.
the student. So if you can change the structure in such a way that allows the student to really um, find that place of safety, physical safety, emotional safety, and all that. And then materials or an environment of other people, just an environment where they can open up to their talents, because we all have talents and all students have different talents. And some students are, you can say they're talented in an interpersonal way, or some students are talented musically. Um, but we all have those talents. And so that's when you start to see the talents come out, and then they resonate. Oh, wow, look, I'm able to do this. They make a connection to themselves, really, is what it is. And then they start to trust themselves. They have an internal dialogue going that says, hey, trust yourself. Who are they trusting? They're trusting their higher nature, just like us, adults. We want to trust our higher nature, that inner self, what I would call pure consciousness or God or whatever you want to call it, the soul inside. Try being able to trust that. And then that's a development. They start to trust it, and then they become more and more trusting of outside, and then that reflects back, and it's like a cycle that just continues and grows. And that's the same thing in yoga, when you sit down to practice for the first time, there's maybe not the first time, but soon thereon, there's a joy that you feel. There's a sense of letting go of the jumping mind, you could say, or the distracted mind, or the undisciplined mind. So for me, discipline is really innate. It allows us to focus, and it brings joy, and it brings happiness. So they actually work together, the freedom and the discipline. But I actually, when I first got into education, this is a paper that I wrote, Discipline and Freedom, my first paper.
Awesome.
It was philosophy paper. So it's an interesting question that you asked.
I love it. I'm so glad you said all of that because I agree. I think sometimes people are afraid of discipline, afraid of structure, and thinking that it dampens freedom. I'm like, actually, no, it can. There's oppressive discipline, oppressive structures, but you don't throw away structure to get freedom. No, actually, structure helps facilitate it. And we as human beings, we naturally gravitate towards that because of those reasons that you mentioned. And yeah, I love it. I love it. There's even in the Western psychological tradition, I always mess this man's name up. I can't say his name. The guy who did the work on flow, and he did some work on creativity as well. And discipline is an important piece of the puzzle. And folks who don't know what I'm saying, I'm so afraid to butcher the man's name. I'll butcher it if I end up saying it. But the guy who did the flow work, Chitman Say Hi or something like that, something of that nature. Those of you who are familiar with it, yeah, you can email me and correct me or something. But at any rate, I think it's important to put that out there, the importance of structure and discipline, and I mean, that's what you're right. That's what education is really all about. We put discipline on ourselves so we can learn something. So we can use that freedom within discipline to actually gain some insight. And that's what we're doing with yoga. I love how you said, you're sitting down and you're practicing, and there's this freedom now to let go of the mental fluctuations of the mind, or let go of our attachment to those mental fluctuations. But if we don't provide the discipline structure or the structure for that, it's going to be difficult to even see that we are imprisoned in the mind. So I love how those two come together.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, and community. Can you say a little bit more about that? And you started off with that with community. Why is community so important in a good life?
Well, I think first, understanding the psychology of the human being, that we're social animals. We basically, our development as a species was facilitated, or is facilitated, continues to be facilitated by community structure, social structures. For example, a child is going to learn from the mother or father, family, whatever. And those people that are around the child, in by mirroring, the mirror neurons that we have, they're going to pick up facial expressions, feelings, thoughts, even. Um, and that wouldn't necessarily happen without a social structure. And human beings are one of the few mammals that really, where the child stays in the family for quite a while to develop that family structure, which is the beginning of the social structure of community. Um, and I think we miss a lot in our Western culture by not having grandparents living in the family, as many of the other cultures around, the Mexican cultures and other cultures that we see around in our area in Watsonville, have a little bit more depth in terms of that social family structure. And I think that really helps, I think that our Western culture of pushing the grandparents out and, um, you know, isolating in a way from family is not really as helpful, because we lose some of that community structure, some of that ability to learn from all the different ages, Anyway, so I think that community is important in that way. I think the beginning is family, and then it branches out. And then once you have, I mean, we want to learn more, right? So I'm learning from you by seeing you and, connecting with you right now. And that's something I wouldn't normally do if I was just, with my family. My community is the Mount Madonna Center, or it was for many, many years, the Mount Madonna Temple group. And then I have my school structure. I was taught at Mount Madonna School for like 35 years. So parents and teachers there. And then the last 10 years, I've been working with the public schools more. So I've developed a sense of community there with the teachers and not so much the students, although I interact with the students, but it's, you don't see them the next year generally. They're off. But I learn a lot from them. I learn a lot from engaging. And I think that's important. There's the Yoga Sutras talks about the big fear. The ignorance is kind of the main stumbling block, you could say. But the bottom line is that we're afraid of losing this reality. This fear of death, and that fear. It's kind of like the underlying fear of all fears. So if I'm afraid of meeting you or interacting with this group of people for some reason, the underlying fear of that is, geez, I might lose this life, But I'm at a stage, I'm 71 now, and I've had two, end of life experiences already, as a young student, and just most recently the last year, where, facing death, and you go, okay, well, we know it's there, but to actually think and ponder about it and to really work with that fear is one of the things that I'm working on right now. And so yeah, so I think just the idea of community is important, to put yourself in a situation where you get a chance to see your fears, you get a chance to see your attachments, your aversions, and basically your ignorance. I mean, really, if we knew that the self, or the pure conscious principle within us, is free, really free, then we'd be done. But we put limitations on ourselves, labels, attachments and labels and so forth that limit us, And so I think the yoga practice and the community practice are both the same. They're trying to remove those veils, those layers that we put on ourselves that hide our light, hide the vision of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I love it. And I love how you start off by saying community structure, discipline again. We're social beings, biologically, the way we've evolved, our psychology, our minds have evolved to be in relationship with others. Even language, it has a direct correlation and relationship with others, communicating with others, working together. And if that's not a part of our view of the good life, something is strange is afoot there. Something,
Yeah.
something not right with that. We need each other, and I think I love how you put it though. I like how you put the structure, the importance of the structure of community. There needs to be there are guidelines in how we relate to each other. And in that structure, within that structure, it's not just pure chaos. Within that structure, we have this possibility of getting to know ourselves truly, who we are, because of our interactions with others in the various communities that we have. And yeah, maybe, we are afraid of. It's hard to be in community for some of us. It's hard to be in community because maybe we are afraid that we'll get to know too much more of ourselves. I'm maybe not consciously thinking that, but we're afraid that if I lose all my labels, all of my identifiers, then what am I going to be? It's all about me, 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 me. And it's like, no, the community kind of constrains that. And the challenges of being in a community, I'm not saying it's all pleasurable being in relationship with a bunch of other human beings. It's challenging. But the challenge is important for freedom, actually, to really discover that we're more than just our labels and our identifiers. And community can force us to see that. Yeah, that makes sense to me because, I didn't really think about it like that. But I'm like, actually, yeah, that makes sense to me, actually. Very similar to just doing your personal yoga practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you subtly brought in, well, you mentioned this earlier. Then I'm going to come back to what we call the kleshas. You kind of throw those out there, those afflictions. And I'll let Premdas unpack those. But you said this several times, engagement. You talked about engagement with students. You talked about engagement in the community. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because that seems to be really important, this idea of engaging
Yeah.
in life.
Yeah. So in order to, I'll speak of the teaching profession because that's how I kind of learned it myself, or how it feels the most expressible and doable to talk about. But you have to, in order to communicate, you have to have a structure, for example, but then you also have to be able to listen, and I think it comes down to that. Listening comes down to loving, the students, but basically loving again is more just getting your ego out of the way. So getting your ego out of the way in terms of a relationship or in terms of engagement means that you're listening. You're open to, we have the structure of, good morning, or how you doing, how things go. The way that we greet people is like the first connection. And then a lot of times, if we're afraid, we start thinking about, oh, what should I say? How do I break the ice? We start thinking about us, and instead of really just being open to being with that person, and maybe there's some silence, a lot of times silence is, awkward silence or whatever, but the silence is kind of off-putting for a lot of people. All of a sudden you can see the mind starting to click, what should I say, blah, blah. And that's okay. That's who we are as human beings, and we have that, going. But after that little, interaction, then all of a sudden, the the force field is down, and then we start to take in, more of the who that person is, that person as an emotional being, or that person as a loving being, or a thinking being, or, having physical problems, understanding like, Jesus, this person is hurting, so we begin to take that in, and I think that's can sometimes be scary, because it's hard for us to acknowledge that pain within us as well, but then, that's kind of like the engagement. I'll bring an example that most recently I've been doing, working with the high school students in Watsonville, and I do testing. I do English language testing with them. It's a one-on-one practice. So I go to the classroom and I ask the teacher if the student is here. And I explain to them, of course, that I'm going to be taking him for 20 minutes, and they all know the system. So the student comes out, and so there we are. So we have a 5-minute walk, or 10-minute walk, or 2-minute walk, whatever it is. And here's this new being, young person, they're in their teens and quite different upbringing than I have had. And I just, how things, hey, how, again, that social dynamic, how are you? How things going, usually ask them a couple personal questions of, do you do sports or you do art? Do you like to do it? Do you like to listen to music? Do you like to sing? Things like that. Things that um, help open that, place up of connection, because who am I? I'm this white guy, coming into, you know, old white guy, coming in to take him out of class and, do English language testing. So that kind of breaks the ice. And then we get in and we'll sit down. And before we even start, I have them do explain to them about deep breathing and about, connecting with their breath, being in the present moment. What is that? Mindfulness, So we do a couple, I call it Dirga, they're called in yoga, but it's basically just breathe in deeply, but exhale slowly. We do a couple breaths, and sometimes I'll close my eye. Actually, I always close my eyes when I do it. And then at the end of 30 seconds or whatever, I'll open my eyes, and sometimes they're in it, they've got their eyes closed. But there's that connection that happens in silence. I was beginning to talk about silence, but there's this silence, and yet there's still a connection, in the silence. And so that is really opening. It's like, okay, we've traversed a little bit of the human situation, here. So now we can open up more. So anyway, that's a most recent experience. But again, it's more just about engaging. How do you engage? It's mindful listening is one way that they talk about in education, but basically just being open to listening and hearing, taking in that other person.
Mm-hmm. Like truly connecting with another person, and really engage connecting with what is, engaging in your learning materials, engage with the teacher, engage with the fellow students, your fellow human beings. And, for me, I think a big part of this podcast and starting this is to try to encourage this type of engagement. Let's listen to each other. Let's connect with each other. We don't have to agree on everything. We don't have to agree with ourselves. If we're not changing, I mean, my views change even over this time over this podcast. I'm like, yeah, I might say that differently now, and I think it's being open to that, being open to hearing what another person has to say and not feel threatened. And I think there's something about us human beings, and I think it's related to those things that you mentioned earlier. I'll get you to address those now. That's not being open to engaging with another human being. Why are we closing ourselves on? What are we trying to protect? What are we taking care of? What are those things, those afflictions that are not allowing us to engage with another person? And I think it's directly related to those afflictions. Can you unpack those 5 afflictions? You just mentioned them, but I would love for you to unpack them in order, just so the audience can get a general sense of those, what we call the kleshas in yoga, but those afflictions. Can you share that with the audience?
Yeah. So in yoga philosophy, the idea and was to take a look at the take a look at the human condition, the evolutionarily, like our body's got 5 senses, and that physical body part, and then the emotional part, and then the mental part. And by studying or looking at our condition, they came up with these. Basically, they're called the kleshas, the afflictions. All human beings have them, or not all human beings, but most human beings, the enlightened ones, the ones that are born in bliss and free already, don't have them. But basically, the human condition is the main one is ignorance, not really remembering that we are pure light and love, or pure consciousness, or God, or the self, or whatever. There's lots of names that we use to describe the being, or the feeling, or the energy, you could say. But that energy, the same energy that is in this universe, this world that goes out and expands to the universe, is the same energy that is inside. And so there's a connection between who I am and the larger universe, So, but we forget, we don't know And that's the basic ignorance, forgetting what's our real nature. And how do we forget? Well, we forget because we have attachments to the senses. So we get pleasure out of experiencing the world. It is wonderful to be able to see things, watch a movie, see your beautiful face, um, to be able to feel, be able to eat and touch. All the different sensual things that we have are part of the human condition. But the problem is that we get attached to certain ones. So we get attached, say, to chocolate milk. And so we want to have that all the time, but then we get sick from it. And we say, oh, well, maybe that's not so good for me, but I'm still like super attached to it. So this idea of attachment, attraction, we call it attraction. And then the opposite of that is the repulsion. So sometimes I don't want to engage with this particular group. I don't want to engage, uh, in this hard situation. So I kind of move away, or I'm repulsed away by certain groups, as you mentioned, certain groups that we don't agree with. So I'm repulsed by that. So we have this kind of attraction and repulsion, um, back and forth that happens. And again, that's part of the ignorance. That's the layering of the ignorance that we have. And then we get, the last one, the fifth one, is this idea of fear of death. We have this fear of dying. What is death? It's forgetfulness of who I am. In my tradition, or in my belief, I believe that um, there's reincarnation. So this particular life, if I don't fulfill or don't realize my true nature fully, then I get a chance to do it in another lifetime. And whether you believe in that or you don't believe in that, it's not important. But the basic idea is that we're already free. The freedom is here in this particular moment. Being in the present moment, as yoga would say, is the only place where freedom and love exist. And what gets in the way of that is that ignorance and the attachment. Attachments are basically just desires, right? Desires for something. I have a desire for that chocolate milk, and as I'm drinking it, it's fine. It's food. It's life, right? The nature is giving me food. But then all of a sudden, I think, oh well, maybe if I don't, so someone might take that joy away from me. So I begin to try to protect that, protect the delivery of that, you could say, whatever. And so I have this desire to keep that going. So I have this fear of the future. So even though I was eating an apple, had a pleasurable experience of that, I want another one, and I don't want anyone to interfere with that, right? So I'm afraid of that not happening. And so we have this desire, attachment, and fear. Those are the three kind of afflictions that kind of work around. Um, so desires are not bad. Desires are how we live. We have to fulfill desires in order to live. um, and we have a natural fear of things that to protect ourselves, and that's also very natural as well too. Protect ourselves and our bodies from harm. Um, But what gets in the way of that is just kind of when we overdo it, when we don't really see the underlying principle of love, or the underlying principle of self or consciousness that's there. And that these natural things that we have, these natural desires that we have, are okay. We talk about them as being just part of being human. Like, I need my body to be fulfilled. And this brings up the idea of virtue. I think that was one of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of yoga. Um, so living a virtuous life, and sitting on the mat is one way, but also just living a virtuous life is another option. And I would say that's an option that's open to everybody. Not everyone can, sit down on a mat and have their bodies be comfortable, to do that. But everyone can try to live a virtuous life. And what does we mean by virtuous life? Well, we have things that we believe in that are important to us. Family, let's say, is important to us, or maybe nonviolence to creatures, or protecting nature. Not allowing nature to unfold on its own rather than polluting, or pesticides and so forth that happen around us. So. And those things are, not that they're bad. It's just that's just a way of living a virtuous life. And there's always going to be a drawback to anything that you do in life, because everything is got consequences. There's no, like when I eat a carrot, that's still killing the plant. So there is going to be life feeding on life as an option, or as a truth, you could say, in nature. But at the same time, I want to reduce the effect if I can. So the idea of being not as nonviolent or as loving as I'm able to do within that framework of being a human being. Um, yeah.
Love it. Wow, you didn't say it explicitly in there because I want to tie this to what you just said. But you didn't say explicitly talk about the ego or the self,
Mm-hmm.
the small self, the Broderick, the
Yeah.
personality, and you mentioned something about reincarnation.
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd be useful for folks to for you to unpack that a little bit, and this idea of the clinging and aversion, how that's related to the self,
Mm-hmm.
and is it that self that reincarnates, or is it some other aspect
Mm-hmm.
that is reincarnating? And then I would love to talk about yeah, those things you just mentioned about the virtuous life, and how does that rely tied to the virtuous life?
Okay. Yeah, the last of the afflictions is ego centeredness. There's nothing wrong with the ego. Ego just means I. It's when the I says, "This is for me." Everything is for me only. So I start to gather things around me that I don't need. So I have 5 cars. I have 6 different suits. Or I have, um, I start hoarding things, and what that does is it takes away from, nature has to provide that, so it takes away from the ability of others to partake of the plentifulness or of nature's gifts. So it's just the idea of the ego wants to live forever. So the ego wants to have everything and to not die. So what's wrong with that picture is not the ego. It's just the ego is in ignorance. It's not seeing that everything. The ego actually owns everything. The ego is actually purely free already. We think that we're going to become happy by getting things. Things outside in the outside world are going to make me internally happy. Well, they're going to fulfill a purpose of, keeping the body alive and, um, making life comfortable maybe for others and for the people around us, supporting life. Um, but at the same time, when they start to become a chain, that's when there's a problem. When the ego chains itself to outside events or outside attachments, that's when the vision or the veils start to cover the ego. The ego, which is really pure and in and of its nature is free, completely free, gets veiled. And so that's the ignorance that veils the ego. So yoga basically says, how do we free ourselves from that, those chains and those veils? Well, it's an unpacking. We just start to unpack. We can do that. And the Bhagavad Gita talks about 18 different chapters or ways to do that, 18 different yogas or ways to do that. Meditation, karma yoga, serving others, um, understanding, just reflecting and understanding, like who is this, who am I, self-introspection. So there's many different methods of removing those chains or removing those veils, and yoga would say, try something and see what works for you, and then do it. Do it. So there's no prescription. A lot of people think, oh, yoga is sitting down and doing an hour's worth of asana, or postures, or is meditating, being able to meditate. But that isn't for everybody. Each path is going to be different depending on the individual. And for me, that's the beauty of yoga. That's the religion of yoga. Even though it's not a religion, it says every person's approach to liberation, every person's approach to finding the self within, or removing the veils of the ego, is going to be different and wonderful and beautiful. And that's the appreciation that happens between human beings. I appreciate you. I can appreciate someone who I disagree with, because we're all we're all attached to this life. We're all attached to this ego, and we're all really in the same boat. And that's what kind of in a way unites us. We're all really doing our best. And so I can appreciate someone who I disagree with. So because we have that same you could say battle, or that same process going on of trying to be free. Trying to remove the veils.
Mm-hmm.
So again, a lot of people think ego is bad, but understanding that the ego is really the connection to the pure self, is important. So we need the ego anyway.
Mm-hmm. I know it's the means by which we can live the virtuous life. The means by which we can liberate ourselves is through it. It's just liberating ourselves from those attachments and the false identity associated with the things of the world. And then again, we're afraid to let go of all of that. We're afraid of dying to all that because we've been conditioned to cling to the self and the individual, particularly in our country, our society, our culture, which just has its positive aspects to that. It's beautiful that we can go out in the world and fully express ourselves as an individual. There's nothing wrong with that. But at what price? Do we compromise community? Do we compromise who we are really, truly beyond the character that we're playing? Or we get overly attached to the character and then we don't want to let go of that character, that role that we're playing, and we're doing anything and everything to do that. Such that we'll run further and further away from ourselves by engaging in patterns of behavior that we think is supporting ourselves, but it's only supporting the character, enhancing the character, and we're getting further and further away from that which is always free in our core. So I love it, man. I love it. A lot of times, you're right. A lot of people don't understand what the goal of yoga is, or I've mentioned to someone who teaches Yoga Sutra. I've been doing yoga for a while, and I was saying, yoga is about liberation from suffering. Oh, that's very Buddhist. I'm like, oh, it's yoga too, man. It's really about that, and a lot of us do meditation and asana and for all those different things for various reasons. But I think where the rubber meets the road is virtuous living anyway. What does that mean? I don't know. Ask the question. What does it mean to live a virtuous life, and start to really tackle that? And each one of us is going to see that slightly different, but there are some common themes.
Right.
And by doing that, we get to remove those veils, and then also by doing that, we are expressing our divine nature in the world through those virtues, through that virtuous action.
Yeah. I have a nice in the yoga tradition. There's a feeling that there's a Kali Yuga, right? That there's and I think in the Christian tradition, the idea of the Judgment Day, where everything is going to be boiled, and whatever. So there's this feeling that that the world is headed towards complete ignorance. So I'm a math teacher, and my belief is that in the yoga system, there's different, yugas, they're called eons of time, from the creation of the first cell up into human beings. So in those eons of times, there's different transitions that happen. Well, we're supposedly in the transition where it's called the Kali Yuga, or the age of darkness. So we see a lot of problems around us. The Kali Yuga era is a lot of darkness, or a lot of pain and suffering, you could say. But the human condition, or the human evolution of human beings themselves, is still going up. It's just not curving up as high as it was in the previous epoch. So the evolution is still going up. So we're still evolving, and we see so much positivity and so much creativity, so much love in the world, right? So that's the bar that's still going up, even though it's maybe not as much as in the past. It's still going up. So there's a sense of positivity around yoga as well too, that all is not lost. It's not there's no point in trying to help in the creation because it's just a lost game. So there's still effort to be had in developing community, and engaging with community and engaging in the world in a positive way. This idea of virtues, living a virtuous life, is that continual striving, that continual movement of the human beings themselves as a group, you could say, or just the quality of human life, moving it forward through examples, through this podcast, through people be engaging in a positive way or living a virtuous life, as you say. That we can't really see the effect of that, individually, but we have to trust, and I trust that yoga is doing that, or that engaging positively. I see it in the world. I see this incredible positivity, incredible creativity in young people that I work with in schools, and the yoga community people that I'm engaged with as well, meeting new people. There's just that, love there, and so I really believe it.
Love it, love it, love it. So you've mentioned this many times. I'm glad we caught up to this whole virtuous living aspect of this, and you've mentioned love throughout this conversation. At our core, can you say a little bit more about love? You mentioned love and a few other qualities. You kind of hinted at compassion by recognizing that we're all in this thing together. And you mentioned earlier friendliness, these various qualities. But can you start with love, since you've emphasized that? You said that numerous amounts of time. You said that's who we are at our core. Can you kind of explain that a little bit more to us, and then also say a little bit more about those other values, or I call them virtues, that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, it's interesting. In the Yoga Sutras, there's no love isn't mentioned.
I know.
Yeah, it's not mentioned, but Bhagavad Gita it is. So I take my cue from there, and it's not that it's not in the Yoga Sutras. It's just there's so much else that's in the Yoga Sutras that comes up. But the idea of love is the natural connection that we have to our environment, and to people being part of that environment. It's a natural feeling that we have our connection. And what happens is that we identify with like romantic, a type of love that's romantic. That's really what love is, and that's a form of love. That is a way of what is romantic love. It starts off as, hey, I'm giving myself freely to you, and you're giving yourself freely to me. And so that in that giving and that letting go of ego, I call it selfish ego. There's a freedom, and that freedom is love, peace, you could say as well. And then it starts off with parent to child, right? The love that you feel as growing up with your parents, with the people around you that love you, or that care for you, that express caring and loving. And there's that heart feeling of just love. And what is that love? It's basically just that connection to self. So that's how I see love. Love is connection to the pure self, or the pure divine principle within. If you're connected to that, then you're in love. And then that it's like a light, it just shines. So anyway, the Bhagavad Gita talks about it as devotion. Love is basically devotion. So we normally don't have attachments to. Attachments are normally considered impediments or kleshas, but attachment to God, or attachment to virtues, or attachment to positivity is actually good attachments. Eventually, all attachments go, because we realize that attachments are just basically another label that we have, but we have to start somewhere. So the virtues that I find as universal are the ones that are encompassed in the Yoga Sutras, which are practice of nonviolence, which is kind of like, you could say, the highest virtue. So again, there's going to be violence in everything that we do. Stepping on an ant as I walk outside is, a form of violence, but I try to reduce the amount of violence in my life. So for me, I've chosen a vegan lifestyle. I have a license plate that says yoga is vegan. I mentioned in the intro that I have introduced vegan yoga. I mean, vegan yagyas, which is the Indian tradition of fire ceremony. In India, they have ghee is used in all ceremonies. It's considered pure and pure essence, a wonderful ingredient. But there's a way to do that without harming the animals. In our Western culture, the cow is not the ghee that comes from the cow is not really like a pure ghee. It's got lots of stuff happening to it. So I have chosen to not involve the animals in my practice of the yagyas or the traditional fire ceremonies. Um, and in addition to that, traditionally in yoga or in the fire ceremonies of the East, women are not considered allowed, or they're only allowed in certain ones. And so at Mount Madonna Center, we had for a long time, it was just the males that were performing. And so I was instrumental in many of us really trying to change the culture so that it was more of an equanimous situation with men and women being able to offer these rituals. So that was a value that I had that I felt was important for our community, and so I expressed that value and tried to reason with people, and over time, over a couple of year period of time, the values changed in the culture of Mount Madonna's community there in terms of fire ritual. Um, so nonviolence, and then being truthful. Being truthful means, you know, not being truthful to get something, but being truthful because, it's like a principle of truthfulness. Um, and then non-stealing, non-hoarding. I've talked about this before. Non-possessiveness, not really, taking more than you need, basically. Um, and then the the idea of purity, the idea of living a life where you're not intoxicating yourself or you're not putting drugs in your body that prevent you from experiencing the world fully. So the idea of purity, living a pure life. And then there's some austerity, that you have to, in order to understand desire, you have to put a limit on them. Once you put a limit on them, you see how strong they are. And then you begin to deal with what's appropriate in this desire, how this desire to live is important. I need food and I need, this and that. But within that structure of putting a limit on desire, I see my needs versus my wants, needs versus wants. Yeah, and then contentment, geez, I have you here. I have my family. I live a pretty contented life. I'm really blessed, So just feeling the idea of contentment and then wanting to share that, wanting to not have it all to myself, realizing that people need to have the benefits that I have as well too. So just trying to, make donations, supporting people, whatever it is, in whatever way I can, So those are some of the. I think compassion is in there. That's a big one for connection with people. Just being able to. I mentioned before the idea of how do you listen. You have to listen with compassion. That's the key. Being open to the struggles of another human being. What they're going through. That's the compassionate link.
I love it. I think cultivating those positive qualities, and I mean, language is funny, it's limited, but excuse me, we use the word attachment in various situations, and there's positive ways of talking about attachment and not so positive ways of talking about attachment. But in the positive way of talking about attachment is, like you mentioned, to be devoted to something. There's a certain level of attachment. Like I'm not a theist, and so I think I'm devoted to the various this notion of love, and I don't want to put love in a box, but this idea of connection is a feeling. Like you talked about this from the beginning. Like for you, it's a feeling. It's something and we use language to try to make sense out of our feelings.
Mm-hmm.
But this feeling of love, this and the various ideas that I've come up with and I get from others about what love is, that's what my devotion is. That's what my attachment to is to. That's my deity if I had one. But I don't want to personify it. I don't want to put it into any kind of box because that becomes, yeah, that becomes crazy making to me personally. It can become crazy making. And I love that. I love that. Um, that we can be devoted to something, we can be attached to something in a positive way. Just like when there's this idea of attachment theory and was it psychology or whatever. When a kid has I've forgotten the language of this, but a healthy attachment between the parent and the child, and why that is important for the child's neurological development, the development that you were kind of talking about earlier, how to be in relationship with other people, their own personal ego development. Attachment is a positive attachment, a healthy attachment between a parent and child is really important. So yeah, we can look at all these things in a nuanced way, and that's why I enjoy having conversations with people such as yourself. You've been engaged in yoga practice a lot longer than I have. And there's always room to learn. There are lots of things I'm sure you and I don't agree on. Yeah, that we do not agree on. And that's fine. I think the important thing is that we have this conversation. We have the conversation and realize that, man, we really have a lot in common. For me, that love is it. That's my thing. That's the thing that I use. That's my guiding principle. And then there are all these other positive qualities where kindness, compassion, friendliness, all these different things that I'm working on to cultivate. And I think it's an ongoing process. But it's good to have that and recognize that we have a common interest amongst ourselves. And if we actually allow ourselves to engage in conversation with another person. And that's what I'm trying to encourage with this podcast. It seems like that's what you're encouraging as well, is to be engaged with one another. It's so important to open ourselves to another, the possibilities, just have compassion. First, empathize and see that, oh, wow, they're human like me. They're fallible just like me. Or even recognize that I'm fallible and kind of escape our narcissism. That's what I mean earlier when, we can get so attached to ego, these identities, character, the role that we're playing, that we become narcissistic. And that's very prominently evident in our society. And we live in a society where that's kind of celebrated, where the virtues of humility is not encouraged in many spaces in our society. So I think it's wonderful that you brought up all those different pieces of the puzzle, and and it's important that we not forget those different pieces of the puzzle because they're crucial. And recognizing that love is my thing. Love seems to be a big your thing as well, and yet we can debate all kinds of other stuff. And that's great. That can be fun. We can learn something from each other in the process, our different views, our different perspectives. We might describe things slightly different. So I'm going through all of this. I'm saying all this at the end here for the audience to be like, it's not about agreeing. It's not, if someone says something slightly different for you, or it's okay. I might have someone else here who's been practicing yoga for 40, 50 years, and they might say something slightly different. They might not bring up love. They may just focus on liberation and freedom. That's it. And that's okay. What do we have in common? What can we learn in the process of dialogue about this question? I think this question invites us to engage. I mean, you play with the words of you to open and engage with another human being and learn, be open to learning something. I like how you say, even though we may be going through a Kali Yuga, or we going through a time of darkness, I really believe that too, Premdas, that we are still evolving.
Yes.
We're still evolving throughout this process. And but it requires work, it requires effort, and it requires a healthy form of attachment to some positive ideals or values or virtues that's going to help us get there. Well, I won't get there, but help us along the way. I don't know if you ever get there. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, do you have anything else you would like to share? Any other thoughts that you would like to bring to
Yeah,
bear here?
I think my main thought at this point is just really appreciating people like yourselves that are trying to bring this idea of conversation and connection more open. And your podcast is one example of that. The podcast I was involved into. It was called Yoga is Vegan. I kind of made the reference to that. This woman was doing as well too about just violence in the food industry and so forth. And yeah, so she had a podcast, and so she's bringing it to people. It's not about we're right. It's not like I'm right. It's just about talking. Getting people to talk and seeing ultimately that there's a lot more that's connecting us than is difference. And even in our differences, we can learn from each other. We can appreciate the differences because difference is what makes the whole equation full.
Yes.
So I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me here. I'm really a pleasure to do this. And yeah, so thanks.
Yeah, and a quick note on that whole yoga is vegan thing, and a lot of you say the word vegan, people think it's a toxic term, and I'm like, I mentioned this on a couple of podcast episodes before this one, and and I was talking about it, and I was saying something about I'm not saying that you have to be this way, but I should have the right to share why I am doing it, and I think the why without telling people that they have to. And then I mentioned something about I was referring to factory farming as barbarism, and I'm like, and he's like, no judgment. And he was joking with me when he said it, but I'm like, but it is. Like we should be able to say that factory farming is problematic of animals. And everyone would agree with that if there was a factory farm of dogs or cats. They would be like, oh no, 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 no. You can't do that. This is insane. But I think that that's something we humans do have in common, and I'm with you on that. I think that there's a lot more to what's happening with taking milk from cows. That's what it's required in order for it to do that. I don't think people want to really admit that.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jains, who are some people might consider extreme, but they really do take nonviolence seriously. And like you said, I engage in violence, but I want to minimize that violence to the best of my ability. So before I know if anybody heard the word vegan, please don't run away. Or no one is bashing you upside the head and telling you that you're evil because you're doing something that vegans suggest that you should not do. But there are benefits to doing that, and I think this nonviolent core is why I do it now. I started as a health reasons, but I don't think you have to be vegan to have a healthy diet. But the main reason why I'm doing that is because of this idea of nonviolence and trying my best to minimize my contribution to violence. And if it's not necessary to consume animal products, then why do so? And I think nature is trying to tell us that this is maybe not a good idea with the environmental situation.
Yeah.
So just wanted to put that out there because I'm sure you're right. You familiar with
Yeah.
the anti-veganism? That's like wow. I'm like really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've really appreciated you're here, and I learned something. I didn't know that you were vegan either, and I really appreciate you coming here, taking the time to share your wisdom, your knowledge. I really respect the elders there at Mount Madonna Center, the elder yogis, people who've been living their lives trying to overcome suffering, not just for themselves, but for the world. I think there's a lot there that you all have to share with us. And as we explore this question of what is a life worthy of living, what's really important, what really matters about life, I think the yoga tradition has a lot to say about that, a lot. And I'm grateful for you to come to share a little bit of what you've been exploring. Wait, most of your life. Well, how many years? I'm gonna put you out there, call you out.
I'm 71.
71. And so you started yoga on 74, so 50 years.
Yeah,
Wow. You old, man.
I am. It's true.
Well, thank you so much. Until next time, my brother.
Okay, brother. Thank you very much. Namaste. See you.
Thank you so much for tuning into the show. I hope this conversation has inspired you to reflect on your own views of the good life. If you enjoyed the show and want to hear more inspiring and thought-provoking conversations, please follow, write a review, and rate us on your favorite podcast app. If you are tuning in on YouTube, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support is very much appreciated.